Hi again, sports fans. Election day in Canada, consequential election, no doubt. 36 days of campaigning culminates into tonight's vote. I'm joined by Karissa Donkin to break it all down. Karissa, we've heard so much about Canada-U.S. relations, pipelines, tariffs, environmental issues. Where does sport land on the priority list?
Well, first of all, Devin, I love an election. I always find election day just to be so exciting. But when we're talking about sport, obviously, like you said, it has not been the major issue of this campaign. There have been a lot of other significant things on the table, but a lot is at stake for sport in this election. And a lot of folks might not know exactly what role the federal government has in sport. So basically how it works is the federal government funds athletes as they pursue their sport. They fund the national sport organizations. As we've seen recently, they can control how much funding those national sport organizations get. When we look at like Hockey Canada, for instance, what went on with that organization recently, that is sort of the power that the federal government has over NSOs. And then they can also address what has been described as a safe sport crisis in Canada. So one big thing, Devin, that we'll be watching is the Future of Sport in Canada Commission, which has held hearings across the country and wraps up its mandate in March of next year. So the next government, whoever is responsible for sport in the next government, it's going to be their job to look at those recommendations and decide what to do with them and how we can make sport safer in Canada. So there is really a lot at stake, even though it's not a big issue. You look in the party platforms and you're not going to find a reference to sport. None of the parties got back to me when I asked them, what are you planning to do for sport? But there is a lot at stake.
It's so important for you to point out, this stop and start when a new government comes in, if there is a new government, or however it unfolds today. And I also love an election. I think it's because we all love sports. Karissa, an election feels like that sort of this unscripted nature of what might play out today. But there always seems to be, a lot of work done, and then you might have a change, or you might have a new minister or no minister at all, and then it's left up to that person or people to sort of fill in the gaps. So what's your sense on how important having a specific sport minister overseeing this file?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. And it's worth noting we've had a lot of different people responsible for sport in this country over the last few years. It hasn't really been consistent. And then, of course, when you have someone new come in, they've got to get up to speed. And there is that sort of transition time. And in the last cabinet shuffle before the election was called, we did see the Minister of Sport title drop. So that was transferred over to somebody else's portfolio. So it fell under Canadian culture and identity. So that is the question. I mean, in the eyes of the public, obviously having a Minister of Sport, it just increases the public awareness of what role the federal government plays in sport at a grassroots level, or when we're talking about safe sport. But asking, the folks who this is their day to day. I spoke with Canadian Olympic Committee CEO David Shoemaker last week and asked him about that. Is that something that matters to you to have a minister of sport? And here's what he had to say.
I think that as it relates to sport, it's well established that whomever becomes the next prime minister, or whatever party takes over in terms of power, will be a strong supporter of sport and see it for the important role that it plays in this country. Whether we have a specific sport minister or whether we have a minister with a broader portfolio that includes sport, the key for us is that it's somebody who is a strong advocate for sport, understands the needs of athletes, understands the needs of our sport institutions, gets that, and makes the strong case for them within caucus and within the federal cabinet.
Karissa, I can imagine that Shoemaker, the Canadian Olympic Committee, the Canadian Paralympic Committee, a lot of national sport organizations are waiting with bated breath today. Ahead of the Paris 2024 games, there were so many calls and headlines about the fact that there hasn't been increased funding to keep up with inflation and cost of living and everything that the athletes are trying to accomplish. What's your sense on that, having talked to Shoemaker about their hopes and dreams of what a government can add in terms of funding?
Yeah, Devin. So I think back to that closing ceremony in Paris where David Shoemaker was speaking, and he was talking about how what's really at stake here is Canada might not live up to its potential, that there's unlocked potential there that we're not unlocking because there hasn't been a significant funding increase in nearly 20 years. So that could affect our performance in Italy next year. It could affect our performance in Los Angeles in 2028. Now, speaking to Shoemaker this week, he said he's confident that they've made the case. The question that has come back from the government over the years is show us the evidence, show us the data. So 2 years ago, we know that there was a study commissioned by Deloitte that pulled that data that showed that national sport organizations are expected to run huge deficits in the coming years. And so the ask has been $144 million in increase in funding. And I think really what's at stake, I mean, we talk about our performance at the Olympics and the Paralympics, but it's also looking at, how do we nurture the next Quinn, the next Marie-Philippe Poulin, the next Summer McIntosh. And I think that could really be at stake here.
Yeah, own the podium, right? I mean, what I'm hearing from you and what I've heard from so many of our athletes is there is a direct correlation between having all those resources, being able to be an athlete, and not having to focus on how you're going to pay the bills or afford groceries. Karissa, maybe just a word on Sport Canada. I think to the average Canadian, it can get a little lost in the weeds in the role Sport Canada plays. So how does the government of the day collaborate with Sport Canada to ensure that athletes' needs are being met and that maybe some of that funding reaches grassroots levels as well?
Well, I think there's two main things that we look at when we're talking about Sport Canada. So one is the athlete assistance program, what a lot of people commonly call carding. So for a lot of athletes, like you alluded to, Devin, it's their lifeline. It's how they buy their groceries. It's how they pay their bills, and it's really something they wouldn't be able to compete in their sport without. So that is huge. And then the other element of it is that Sport Canada funds national sport organizations. So when we were talking about Hockey Canada and what Hockey Canada needs to do to change hockey culture a couple of years ago, what a lot of people might not know is, Sport Canada, the federal government doesn't control Hockey Canada. They do their own thing, but they do get funding from Sport Canada. So in that sense, they wield a lot of power, and they can, have a lot of control over what national sport organizations do. They can have them prioritize safe sport, which we've seen over the last couple of years, that the funding can be a bit of I wouldn't say a carrot, but almost a way of pushing the sport organizations forward to do that. And I think, what we're looking at in this election is whatever direction the next government sets, whatever the next minister sets, it could determine what we see in the future of at the grassroots level. And then that can relate to the professional level. It can relate to the Olympic level. And so I think there's a lot at stake.
Okay, last one for you as we wind down on what is going to be a riveting evening, whatever way it goes. Maybe just 10,000-foot view. I know you and I are diehard sports fans. So many people across this country are. Few things bring this country together like a great sporting moment at the Olympics or Paralympics. Maybe just give us some thoughts from your perspective, Karissa, on what feels like a real important moment for Canada. There is this nationalism we're seeing play out every time an anthem is played at an NHL playoff game. So maybe just give us some high-level thoughts on going into tonight and this election and the role sport plays in our country. Of course, there was this new campaign just launched.
Yeah, I mean, like we said, it's not the big issue in the campaign. Obviously, sport is probably not on people's minds when they're going to the ballot box, but it is this sort of unifying thing that we have. It does bring us together, like you said. I mean, we think about the Four Nations face-off earlier this year, the Canada-US game. I don't think I've seen anything bring us together like that. Or we think about watching summer in the pool, or watching our 4x100 men's team last year at the Olympics. So I think at a time when our sovereignty is being questioned, we can look to sport as something that can bring us together and sort of remind us a little bit about who we are. And that's really what the Canadian Olympic Committee was thinking when they pulled this campaign together. And it's hard to watch the campaign and not feel a little bit of pride, I think.
I was just reveling in that, all of those great moments, those where were you when moments. It feels like that's what today is going to be about. Where were you when? Karissa, fantastic perspective. Thank you for the context. Of course, exercise your democratic right. Elections.ca is a great resource. It'll give you all the things you need to know about how to vote today. CBC will be on the air with our election specials starting at 6:30 p.m. Eastern. Karissa, thank you.
Always a pleasure.